Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's show is the brand new and exclusive story from the incredible mind of Jack LaFountain. Show some love and support to Jack by heading over to the Amazon bookstore, which I'll leave the link in the description box below. Of course, as ever, please do let me know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. Why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid crew. And so, with that aside, let's get into tonight's story, entitled Tracks, Haunted Warrior, The Summertime Story. Let's get straight into that. An introduction. On the surface, Haunted Warrior may seem a strange title for a Bigfoot tale. And that is true, except for that this story, while prominently featuring Bigfoot, is not exclusively about Bigfoot, or Siatic as they are known to the Salish natives of the Pacific Northwest. The story is based on the indigenous myths surrounding the giant creatures that are their forest neighbours. Interspersed here with tribal tales are additional bits of oral Sasquatch encounters told to me that have been woven into the narrative. I will admit to adding a touch of tenderness and a sense of justice and honour of my own making into the telling of the tale. I did this because I get a real sense that Bigfoot encounters change the lives of those who experience them. I am a believer that these changes are, or certainly can be, positive outcomes for the people involved. Chapter 1. The gentle rocking and rhythmic clack of the tracks beneath him lent a subtle heaviness to Blaine's eyelids. They slipped slowly, inexorably downward despite repeated jolts of attention that tried to raise them and keep them open for more than a moment. Sleep crept in on him, and though sleep was no longer his friend, he surrendered to it and dreamed. In the trenches along the Marnie, he had welcomed sleep and a break from the monotony of training and hardships of the trench life. War and death raged all around him. Rain soaked him, and mud clung to him, but sleep had carried him away from all of that, often to the pine forests of home. As long as he slept, there was peace. But one day in July, everything changed. The orders came down from the men with stars on their shoulders, and Blaine and his comrades moved towards the German lines, and sleep stayed behind, seemingly forever. How they cheered for God and country as they ran behind a rolling barrage of big guns and into the throats of thundering artillery and machine guns belching fire and lead. The cheers died as quickly as did the front line. Gaping holes swallowed the line of men in their khaki uniforms. Men he loved, in the mystic affection the soldiers hold for one another, fell torn to pieces, never to rise again. The air roared and the earth shook. Still he kept running into the hell before him. His body jerked, his left arm was wrenched behind him, and the rest of his body spun into a wild pirouette. He thought for a moment that wire had caught his arm, but there was no wire, no obstacles marred his path. He fell on his back with a grunt as the air was forced from his lungs. He was looking up at the sun above him, then a dim white disk far above the smoke, and then he lost consciousness. He awoke on the train with a start, his breath rapid, his heart hammering in his chest. Did I scream? He wondered. Blaine looked around the car. No one was looking at him, not even the man beside him. He heaved a sigh of relief. Sometimes he screamed. He had yet to decide if the scream resulted from being shot or from the memory that hung over the dream like an evil shadow. His eyes closed. The smell of burned flesh filled his nostrils, and he was back. Pain danced in waves up and down his arm. The pain screamed in his head, but beyond him all was quiet, eerily quiet. He tried to rise and the pain in his arm doubled. He moved his fingers and it doubled once more, even though they had refused to move. And when he opened his eyes again, the sun, it was gone. He dared to move his head, trying to see what had caused the pain, but it was too dark. Am I dead? The thought flashed across his mind. The thought was followed immediately by the sincere hope that he was not, or he did not want to be dead, even though it hurt terribly to be alive. Hands then lifted him from the ground, and he looked up at the dark shadows moving over him in the night. Don't worry, one shadow said. We got you. Well, it's going to be bumpy, but hang on. We'll get you out of here. And then the hands touching him vanished. He rose into the air and began to move forward. Back on the train, he was then wide awake and fully in the grip of the memory. He remembered pain jolting him as they deposited the stretcher onto the floor. His vision swam for a few seconds and then cleared to reveal the jagged piece of metal impaled in his wrist. His uniform was charred around the wound, his skin a pale white under the dried blood. He tried to sit up and see where he was. The universe went into a spin and dropped him back into blackness. And so began the trip he was on, the trip that had been going on for what seemed an eternity. He travelled from the regimental aid post to the field hospital, and then into surgery, and finally by rail to an evacuation hospital. After a long bout with infection, he returned to surgery and then yet another hospital before being put on a ship bound for America. They mustered him out of the service with no ceremony and gave him a Purple Heart-shaped medal and a train ticket for home. Well, a ticket to Seattle, that is. It wasn't like the Marines really knew or cared where his home was. A year had passed in the world around him, and he didn't seem to notice, didn't care. Every day looked like the one before it, held the same memories and the same nightmares. Sometimes he wondered if time passed at all, and for him it was still a summer day in France. Every sudden noise was still artillery, every rattle and pop were machine guns, every shout was an order to go over the top, and sleep was the highway that never failed to carry him back there, and the empty end of his left sleeve was proof when he awoke that it was all real. Sometime early the next day, he would be in Seattle, and with luck, home by nightfall. And for a moment, it was enough just to get there. He had no delusions that home held some magic that would change his days or make him whole again, and he glanced down at his side. Funny, I can still feel the hand I no longer have. The home he remembered had no more use for a one-armed man than did Blackjack Persian. Men back home in Shelton worked felling trees, hauling and cutting logs. They worked the mill like his father did, and some worked the manganese mines or ran dairies. That's what real men did, whole men. What was he going to do? Get there, he told himself. Right now, just get there. And getting there he could do. In fact, he was tired of doing it, tired of the unrelenting clack of the rails, tired of the hum of the wheels, and tired of the people staring at his uniform and with his empty sleeve. He was tired of living. He closed his eyes to block it all out, if only for a moment. His stomach rumbled, a reminder that he had not eaten that day. He ignored it and turned his head to stare out of the window where darkness was making its way over the fields of alfalfa, alternating with fields of potatoes as they passed through southern Idaho. He closed his eyes and was carried off to sleep. Chapter 2. Blaine opened his eyes. Outside his window, the sky above the pine trees burned bright red and gold. He had slept in fits and starts, waking long enough to stretch or relieve his bladder, and then falling back into a mercifully dreamless rest. He rubbed the sleep from his eyes and ran a hand over the stubble on his chin, A porter entered at the far end of the car and meandered down the aisle. He gave a nod of hello in Blaine's direction. "How long to Seattle?" Blaine asked. "Let's see," he said, pulling a watch from his pocket. "King Street Station in 2 hours. Eggs and bacon in a dining car, if you like." "Thank you," Blaine said. "Maybe I will." He walked to the dining car but couldn't persuade himself to eat. He settled for stretching his legs and then returned to his seat. He told himself he would eat when he got to Seattle. As the porter predicted, the train rolled into King Street Station a few minutes before 8 o'clock. He let the other passengers in the car get to the doors before shouldering his bag and stepping off. And the platform was crowded with people coming and going. A soldier, getting off the next car, was greeted with a joyous screech. The man dropped his bag and threw his arms open to receive the blonde girl running to greet him. A woman with 2 small children in tow embraced her waiting husband, who gathered up their children and carried them from the platform. Sons, daughters, wives, sweethearts, and parents welcomed those they loved. And though he had asked no one to meet him and expected no one, the sight of so many joyful reunions opened afresh the cold, dark hole where his heart used to be. His life, like his sleeve, it was empty, but he still felt the pain that was real. He passed through the doors into the station. The terrazzo floor, with its inlaid mosaic tiles, glistened in the light of the bronze chandeliers. The vaulted ceiling soared above the lines of columns supporting it, and before he could go in search of a place to shave and wash his face, a sound behind him caught his attention. He turned to see a white-haired lady trying to wrestle a trunk through the doors, and with little success. He jogged over to hold the door open for her. "Come inside, ma'am," he said. "I'll get that trunk for you." "Oh, thank you, young man," she told him. "My son was supposed to be here to meet me, but I can't imagine what's keeping him." That's all right, ma'am. You go get a seat on one of those benches over there. I'll be right behind you." He got her settled and cast about for a lost son. Finding no one, he sat on the bench beside her. "I'll just sit here and wait with you, if you don't mind," he said. "Oh, you're so thoughtful," she replied. "I'm sure he'll be along any minute." Now a score of minutes passed without the arrival of the prodigal. He learned the woman had lost her husband several years before and was moving to Seattle to live with her son and his wife. The trunk at her feet held all the worldly goods left to her after 40 years of marriage. Her son Thomas was the owner of a brewery in Olympia, and she wasn't altogether in favor of alcohol. She had been a teetotaler all her life. But he had done well for himself, and she was happy that she would have his family for company. And Blaine listened quietly to her story, occasionally revealing a bit of his life before the war. However, they were both growing anxious over the continued absence of her son, and she had twisted the handkerchief in her hand so tight he thought it might never again assume any other shape. Her little knuckles blanched with every twist, and Blaine shifted his weight, squirming in his seat for a moment before standing. I'm just gonna go to the front and see if I can see him," he told her. "But you don't know what he looks like." He'll look like somebody who is looking for someone." Blaine smiled at her. "Oh, yes," she said. "I suppose you're right." He was about halfway through the station when he saw a large truck pull up to the front of the building. He couldn't make out the name on the side, but Brew & Co. was clear enough. He turned and walked back to the widow. "I think he's here," Blaine said. "A vehicle from a brewing company just pulled up out front. I'll carry in your trunk. Let's go see if it's him." Thomas Pruitt greeted his mother with a warm hug and apologized profusely to them both for being late. Eager to be on his way, Blaine shook hands with Thomas and made ready to go. The lady surprised him with a hug and a pat on the cheek before she climbed in. Blaine watched the truck turn the corner, picked up his bag, and walked down the second street towards the waterfront. He glanced back only once for a look at the King Street Station's impressive 12-story clock tower, and then he turned west on Yesler and was soon standing in front of Pier 3. The squat bulk of the Galbraith, Bacon & Co. building filled the wharf. At the far end of the pier, the ferries to Shelton waited. He weaved in and out through the people, coming and going, until he reached the ferry. Sorry, the man at the ticket window told him. The city of Shelton pulled out just a few minutes ago. That's her going there. Blaine groaned and turned his head to see the boat steaming away. He turned back to the window, hoping to see a schedule, but didn't see one. There is a dode, about to leave for Hoodspot, the man offered. Leaves in about 15 minutes. You can get some coffee across the way while you wait. That will do, Blaine said. Give me a ticket for that one. I'll walk from there if I have to. Blaine bought his ticket and sauntered across the wharf for a cup of coffee, and steaming cup in hand, he dropped his duffel next to the window of the coffee stand, plopped down on top of it, and leaned back against the wall to wait. The salty spray and cool wind in his face, it felt good as the day warmed. The calm waters of the Sound slipped steadily under the bow as the steamboat headed west towards the mouth of the Hood Canal. It was not really a canal at all, but a deep fjord that formed a large hook into the heart of the land of his mother's people, the Huana. The Skokomish people and their settlement near the delta of the Skokomish River took their name from the Huana language. As the boat started into the canal, Blaine noticed that a dark-skinned woman about his age was looking at him from behind a basket she carried on her lap. One peeked at him from beneath her long lashes. Their eyes met, and she smiled at him. He smiled in return and, without thinking, lifted his thumb from the rail to wave at her. Her eyes dropped as quickly as her smile faded. Damn, he thought. Why does it have to feel like it's still there? He dropped his left arm and turned back to stare out over the rail. His stomach rumbled, and waves of nausea mimicked those rocking the Dode. He found a place to sit and rested his head in his hand. Chapter 3. The Dode arrived in Hoodspot in the late afternoon. The boat would continue on to Union, which was a little closer to Shelton, but Blaine's stomach felt queasy, and he decided that he had had enough water travel for the day. He threw his bag over his shoulder and walked down the plank to the pier. A short way from the wharf was a small store, and Blaine angled towards it, hoping to find something to eat to soothe his uneasy stomach. A little bell suspended above the door tinkled as he entered the shop. The floor creaked beneath him as he walked over to the wide counter that ran nearly the length of the store. A shiny tin-tone cash register occupied the center of the counter. It was surrounded by glass jars of lemon drops and a rainbow of gumballs, sticks of peppermint and horehound candy, and behind it, shelves of neatly stacked canned goods climbed to the ceiling. The scent of vanilla, roses, and lemon verbena drifted from bottles of perfumes on a nearby shelf to fill the air. A black iron stove dominated one corner, flanked by barrels of flour, sugar, and dried beans. Along the wall to the left were 2 rows of shelves filled with decorated baskets woven from sweetgrass. He remembered his grandmother weaving baskets like that when he was a boy visiting her village. The only thing that seemed to be missing was the proprietor. "Hello," he said. "Anyone here?" He leaned over the counter to see if someone might be in the adjoining room. He could see a table made of rough-cut pine and polished to a shine, and 3 empty chairs of the same design, and sitting in the middle of what appeared to be a kitchen. "Hello," he called a little louder. The bell above the door tinkled, and he turned to see the man who had met the boat coming through the door. He was a little shorter than Blaine's 5'10", and heavily built. His black hair was streaked with grey and pulled behind his ears, falling in a long braid. In back, it was tied with an oyster shell clasp. His skin was dark, his face was round, and his cheekbones were high. Sorry to keep you waiting," he said. "Had to see the ferry underway. What can I do for you?" "I just got off the ferry," Blaine told him. "I was hoping to find something to eat before I get on the way. I have a bit of a walk ahead of me." "Are you from around here? You look familiar," the man said. Not exactly," Blaine replied. "I grew up in Shelton, but I used to spend summers here near the river." "There is a ferry that goes right to Shelton, you know." "Yes, I know. I missed it by 5 minutes and couldn't bear the thought of waiting overnight in Seattle." "I don't blame you there," the man said. "Do you have a family to come and get you?" "Not really. Blaine replied. My parents live in Shelton, but I didn't tell them I was coming home. They think I'm still in France. I can walk it. I'm sure you can, the man told him. Look, it's too late to start for Shelton today. You don't want to be out in these woods alone at night, and unarmed. Is there somewhere to stay near here? You can stay right here, he said. It's not much, but it's better than the roadside. I'll fix you something to eat, and we can sit by the fire and toast your return home. It's not much of a return home, but why not? Blaine held out his good hand. Blaine Foster, there's my name. Foster, eh? The man took his hand. Not your mother's name, I'm sure. I'm Ernest Dacus. Glad to meet you. Nice to meet you too, but you must let me help you. No, you're my guest, Ernest told him. There's not much to do anyway. It's just some salmon and a few vegetables. How about if you start a fire outside? Leave your bag in the kitchen there. Everything you'll need is out on the porch. Blaine lifted a tarp from the wood stacked neatly at the front of the store and found a box of kindling. He arranged the wood inside the stone ring surrounded by the wooden chairs that sat in front of the store. He got the kindling going, stacked the wood on the fire, and went inside to check on Ernest. Almost ready, Ernest said. Grab some beer from the icebox and meet me by the fire. Blaine got 2 beers and started outside, but Ernest stopped him before he made it out of the kitchen. No, boy, Ernest said with a chuckle. Not a beer, some beer. That is, unless you plan on going to sleep before dark. Well, even if you are, I want more beer than that. And Blaine found a milk crate, loaded it with bottles and retired to the fire. He popped the top off the bottle and set it on one of the chairs. It didn't take long for the alcohol to react with his empty stomach. A warm buzz began in his head about halfway through the first beer. Ernest came to the rescue moments later with plates of smoked salmon and squash, onions, and potatoes to roast. Hell of a thing this war, Ernest said, around a mouthful of fish. I was in Cuba. Boy, I thought I was something in that uniform. At the beginning. But it's never as full of glory and heroics as a man imagines it, is it? You're right about that. Blaine nodded slowly. Just a lot of killing and dying, Ernest said. And for what? Look around you. Nothing changes. We all have to learn it for ourselves. I'm glad you made it home, son. I haven't decided about that myself, Blaine said with a sigh. About what? Being glad you're home? Ernest asked. Well, take it from me. It's a good thing to be alive and home again. May not feel that way now, but if you don't give up, being alive can be a wonderful thing. Just look at this start you made. You're sitting out here under God's clear sky, watching the flames dancing. You eat and you got all the free beer you can care to drink tonight. Yes, sir. That's a fine start. I can pay. Now, don't you dare say anything about paying, Ernest interrupted, cutting him off. If I begrudged giving it, I would have let you walk off down that road without a word. He smiled and then went on. Now, I know it's fallen out of fashion these days, but listen to what an old man has to say. You mean something in this world, Blaine Foster. You may not see it, but I do. I saw it the minute you stepped off the dote. And Blaine held up his empty sleeve. Yes, you had a hell of a loss there, Ernest said, pointing at the missing hand. It's true that I don't know what that's like. I do know that making a living around here won't be easy for you. But because something is difficult, doesn't mean it's not worthwhile. Maybe that makes it even more worthwhile. Anyway, making a living here has always been hard. What the natural troubles don't cause, the Sasquatch do. What's that? Not what, who? Ernest said. Your mother never told you about them? Well, there you go. Angels are watching over you, boy. If you had walked off into the darkness south of here tonight, you might have stumbled onto them. Now that would have been a terrible way to start out your new life. So, who were these Sasquatch? A tribe, an unusual tribe. Pass me another beer, Ernest said as he tossed more wood onto the fire. I can't believe you never heard of them. Didn't your mother or grandmother ever tell you the stories about them? No, not that I remember, Blaine said. I think we got caught between two lives and were never really part of either. That happens, the old man said. But it need not stay that way. Relax, I will tell you about the Addict, and Blaine settled in to listen. When the world began, the first living beings were not like we are now. They were fluid in between with some traits like animals and some like people. The transformer changed the first beings into what they are now: animals, trees, spirits, and people. As the change was taking place, there was one group of beings who did not absorb the Tamanawas, the soul power. They stayed neither animal nor people. I think I do remember hearing that once, long ago. All the animals were people, and all the people were animals. That's kind of like what you just said. Ernest nodded. So, we call the ones who never transformed the Addict. They're still in the forest today, or they can speak the language of every one of our tribes and imitate any bird, but they do not show themselves. When they hunt, their stare can hypnotize game so they cannot run away. They stay to themselves in the trees most of the time, although they are said to come into villages from time to time to steal food or women. Sometimes they play obscene jokes on the villagers. Blaine stared. If all of that was true, he couldn't believe he had never heard of those people, or whatever they were, before. They have no villages but wander about according to the season, following the food. In the spring they are further south around Mount St. Helens, but near July, they move south to fish for salmon on the Dugglebush and the Skokomish rivers, so they are close by us this time of year. What do they look like? People or animals? Kind of both. They walk on two legs and they are really big, 7 or 8 feet tall, with black eyes and square, heavy jaws. They have a deep chest and arms like tree trunks, but narrow hips with crooked legs, and they cover with thick, matted dark hair. The Chehalis say that they can put a man's head right off with just their giant hands. They tell stories of the Addict lifting grown men from some of their villages into the air by their ankles and ripping them in two. And Blaine sighed and slowly shook his head. I don't know, Ernest. It sounds kind of far-fetched if you ask me. Blaine told him. How can such a thing exist and no one has seen it? That's the white man in you talking, Ernest said. Our people have seen them. The Addict are not something they often talk about, but they are real. Some say it's bad luck to speak of them. Who knows if they are listening? But do all the tribes tell the same stories about them? More or less. The Klalams call them the Yayapish and tell about a time when the people in one of their villages raged against the Addict for stealing their food and trying to hunt one of their people. After that, the Addict came and killed many men and captured the women. I don't buy it, Blaine said finally, with another shake of his head. Why would they stay hidden? Why not come out and live with the people? We really have nothing that they want, Ernest said. There's still food now and then, but I think it's more for the sport than hunger. These mountains have everything they need and many things that they don't. People are one thing they don't need. They have each other instead. Ernest reached out and tugged on the cuff of Blaine's empty sleeve as a reminder of the nature of human relations. The silence between the two men stretched out for several minutes as they stared into the fire and into their own hearts. Blaine had to admit to himself that the old man had a point. Any intelligent creature would have no part in civilization with its empires and wars. But were the Addict, who raided villages and killed people, that much different? They are real, my boy, Ernest repeated at last, pointing off towards the mountains. I've heard 'em, up there. At night sometimes they call to each other, and also to warn the people to stay away from 'em. But you never seen one? Nope, I ain't never seen one, Ernest said, a faraway look in his eyes. Once in the summer, years ago though, a summer that was a lot like this one. I was camped up on the banks of the Does Wallops, doing some fishing. I had a pleasant fire going and some fish almost done cooking. The smell of the fish floated off on the smoke into the trees. Blaine nodded to show he was listening. A short while later, I heard an owl hoot from the trees behind me, off to my left. I thought the owl might be a bad omen and didn't want to leave my fire, but I desperately had to pee. I finally gave in and walked over to the woods to my right to avoid the owl, you see. Blaine nodded again. He understood that much, at least, about the traditions. Anyway, I did what I went to do and came back to the fire. When I looked down, half of my fish I was missing. I suppose an owl might eat fish, but it sure wouldn't have snatched them off the fire. And that's when I felt like someone was watching me. I mean, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end and my skin had crawled. I noticed the woods had gone silent. No crickets, no frogs, not even any mosquitoes buzzing around my ears. Well, that was a warning sign for sure that something wasn't right, Blaine commented. So I did what anyone who felt alarmed would do. I picked up my rifle and jacked around into the chamber while turning round and around, looking for whoever was there. I couldn't see a soul. Then I heard it as clear as day. It was the sound of somebody peeing over by the same spot I used. Well, that did it. I fired a couple of rounds into the treetops above the place where I heard the sound. Well, that's what you would expect from an animal marking its territory with its scent, Blaine said. Maybe it was even meant as a challenge too. Well, whoever or whatever it was, it moved off through the dark, snapping branches as it went. I believe it was a sciatic. No other explanation made sense. I was glad he went away because he had to be huge. The ground shook when he walked. And when I could no longer hear him, the night sounds, they came back. Crickets started singing and the mosquitoes returned to buzz and bite. And what did you do after that? Well, I built up the fire and sat there with my rifle in my lap until daylight. And then I got myself right out of there. Were you scared? Damn right I was scared, Ernest said. I have never been back to that spot ever again. Believe me, son, you better off here tonight. They sat by the fire drinking beer for another 2 hours, while Blaine regaled his host with tales of Paris, London, and New York. Ernest stopped him now and then with questions about the people and the great buildings. Blaine's description of the wonders of modern architecture that rose up into the sky amazed the old man, who had been to Seattle once and admired the clock tower at the railroad station. Finally, the old man stood, yawned, and declared himself ready for bed. Blaine sat by the fire a while longer. Ernest told him where to find a bed when he was ready and promised to leave blankets out for him, despite Blaine saying the night was too warm to need them. Blaine popped the cap off the last beer, crossed his feet atop of the stone fire ring. The moon made an appearance above the trees, lending a bit of pale light to the night. He glanced up at the canopy of flickering stars, and for a moment envied his host for his simple life in such a beautiful place. He threw another block of wood onto the fire, watching while the flames grew around it until he reduced it to ash. It was not the creature's prowl of the night around him that Blaine feared. It was the terror lurking in his dreams. But that night, his dreams were peacefully quiet. He awoke the next morning to the smell of bacon and coffee. Following his nose, he found his way to the kitchen, where Ernest was pulling an iron skillet of golden biscuits from the oven. Good morning," he said. "I'm about done here. Help yourself to some coffee. How'd you sleep?" "Good," Blaine said, and a quick smile lit his face. "Surprisingly good. It's been a while for me. Sleeping well, that is." "Glad to hear it. Sit down and dig in. It's just biscuits and bacon, but it's hot and I'm a damn fine cook, if I do say so myself." "That story you told me last night," Blaine said around a mouthful of biscuits. "Did that really happen? I'm not saying you lied, but maybe you were shining me on, just having some fun with me." Ernest studied him over the rim of his cup. Blaine had a sense the old man was measuring him, weighing whether the youngster was the kind to mock him. The lines around Ernest's eyes suddenly softened. "The absolute truth," he said at last. "I don't tell that to just anyone. As you might guess, it's the kind of thing to get an old man laughed at. At least it has in the past." "Why tell me then?" "I don't know for sure," Ernest said. "Seemed like the right thing to do at the time." They shared a laugh, and they had both been in situations where doing the right thing met with unexpected consequences. Good enough for me, Blaine told him. They finished eating in silence, concentrated on Ernest's cooking, which was really good, and Blaine had not eaten so well in a long time. Afterward, he helped Ernest clear away the dishes before gathering his things. "You don't have to go, you know," Ernest told him. "There's not much around here, and the store barely keeps me busy. And the ferry, it only comes once a week. But you can make a nice quiet life here. There's plenty of fish, crabs and oysters. You could sail in Shelton." "That sounds good," Blaine said. "But I have to go see my folks and try to figure out for myself what a man like me is supposed to do now." "Well, I understand that, but take a word of advice from an old man. That wound you're so worried about is not what will hold you down." Ernest tapped his temple. "It's what you allow to go on up here. Anyway, the offer's good. Anytime." "Thanks," Blaine said, shouldering his bag and holding out his hand. "For everything, who knows?" Ernest shook his hand. They walked outside together, and Blaine started down the road. When he turned to look back before the bend, Ernest was still standing on the porch, watching. They waved to each other, and then the tall pines blocked Ernest and his store from view. Chapter 4. The day began warm. The sky is a crystalline, clear blue, mirrored in the waters of the canal. A few wagons trundled along the road, chasing him to the side. Even fewer riders travelled away, leaving the road largely to him. The gentle roll of the hills made the walk pleasant, and he set a leisurely pace compared to the marching he had done in France. He stopped just south of the Hook, in the Hood Canal, and the tiny cluster of homes around the lumber operations at Potlatch. He settled down in the shade of a maple tree to rest, his back propped against the trunk of the tree. He unwrapped a biscuit and some bacon left over from breakfast. Ernest had insisted he'd take it along. Potlatch was a company town, and he thought it best that Blaine not go looking for lunch there. Clouds were rolling in as he reached the town, and by the time he was ready to move on again, the sky had turned damp and grey. A steady wind blew in off the canal, heightening the smell of brine and the tidal mud. A half hour later, the drizzling rain began. Blaine turned up the collar and pressed on. It was Washington, and there was no waiting out the rain. He was just north of the Skokomish River when he came to a small creek with a narrow wooden bridge. He had the road to himself once more. The trees crowded up to the roadway at the far side of the bridge. He started across, little thinking he might meet anyone on the wooden span over the water. He was almost across when something moved with a splash in the water below him. He glanced over the edge of the planks, and a huge black object rose up to meet him. He stared in disbelief as the object became a head and shoulders covered in thick hair. A face turned up to look at him. It had a heavy brow, deep-set black eyes, and a square jaw. The face kept rising towards him. The creature he saw was standing in the creek, yet with one fluid, easy movement, it rose until its head reached Blaine's knee. The thing had a rock the size of a large bread box in one hand. It flipped the stone aside with a flick of the monster-sized hand. The stone clattered among its fellows a dozen feet away. Blaine could not move. It was not fear that paralyzed him, but an empty feeling of disassociation, as if the shock were happening to someone else, and not to him. The black figure beside him did not exist, could not exist, yet there it was. Ernest's sciatic was real, even though it couldn't be. His mind refused to disengage from the paradox, refused to release its grip on his body. And still frozen in place, Blaine watched the creature step up onto the far bank. A single long stride carried it from the creek to the top of the bank. Its eyes never left Blaine as it stepped onto the end of the bridge. Deep black orbs bore into Blaine's eyes. A burning flame of rage seemed to scorch his mind, followed by a growl that issued from the creature's throat and reverberated in Blaine's head and chest. He remained rooted to the spot, still struggling to process what his eyes beheld. The challenge intensified when the creature then spoke. And the word, it made no sense. Blaine didn't understand the language of that single word, but without a doubt, the creature knew exactly what it had said.
Run.
The word exploded in his head. The word could not shake Blaine free, and when Blaine didn't move, the creature reached above his head and with one hand snapped a 4-inch thick branch off a maple tree. The branch was 10 feet off the ground. Blaine's mind calculated, though it made no sense to do so. And as he stood watching, the creature puffed out its cheeks and huffed at him. A quick downward thrust of a giant arm sent the branch flying at Blaine. It sailed harmlessly by, but close enough that he got the scent of fresh sap. The creature took a step forward onto the bridge, and Blaine could feel the planks given under the weight. Massive fists drew up in front of the Seatic's chest as it took a step forward. Blaine felt his muscles relax as reality engaged. He knew he could move again, knew he should move, but he did not. He had no explanation for what followed, not that day nor any day after. Instead of turning and running for his life, Blaine threw back his head and laughed. The sound came from deep inside of him, without sense or reason. An insane, high, wild laugh. In a detached dream from outside of himself, he saw it happen. He saw his head mechanically fall back on his shoulders, heard the crazy laugh from a million miles away in a creeping, slow reality that could not be real. Oh, the numbness, the dark, dead emptiness that lived inside of him. Oh, it rushed to the surface and spilled from his lips. And the creature charged. Blaine's head came forward to meet the rush that stopped less than 2 feet in front of him. The thundering roar the thing loosed at him, it was deafening. The creature's breath, rank with rotten fish, flooded his nostrils. A vision of his impending death ran an icy finger down his spine. And moving in slow motion, Blaine looked up into the creature's face. Their eyes locked, and the rage Blaine saw there matched that of the vilest devil in his mind that he could fathom. Still moving with an uncanny slowness, Blaine lifted his arms and spread them wide in invitation. He closed his eyes and waited. He felt air move on his face, felt the bridge shake, and then he was alone. Blaine opened his eyes in time to see a black figure disappear into the trees. His next breath sent a wave of nausea over him, and he dropped in the middle of the bridge, unable to control the violent tremors that shook his entire body. "Hey, mister," a voice called from over his shoulder. "You need to get off the bridge." Blaine turned to see a young, dark-skinned man with black hair sitting on the seat of a wagon pulled by a dapple-grey horse. He pushed himself up from the planks and crossed the bridge on unsteady legs. The wagon followed close behind him. Sorry to hold you up," Blaine said with a wave as the driver passed. Where you heading?" the man asked, reining in his horse. Shelton," Blaine said. "Climb on up," the driver told him. And they drove into Shelton in the early twilight. Blaine thanked the driver and walked a half a mile from the mill to his father's house. Now, his reception was a mix of the expected that included a gladness inside of him he did not think he would feel. And as he sat in his childhood home once more, his mother cried to have him safely back. His father worried over his future prospects. And no one mentioned aloud the part of him that did not return with him. On the third day following his return, a wagon painted with the name of the brewing company in Olympia pulled up in front of the house. A man with a familiar face stepped down from the driver's seat and strode boldly through the gate to where Blaine sat on the front porch. And Blaine stood and shook his hand and offered him a chair. No thank you," Thomas Pruitt said. "I have to be getting back home. I wanted to thank you once more for helping my mother. That was very kind of you." I'd like to return the favour, if I can. There's no need for that, Blaine said. She's a wonderful woman. It was my pleasure to keep her company while we waited for you. She thinks highly of you as well, he said. That's why I'm here. Oh, how's that? I want to offer you a job with my firm. I'm starting a new route delivering to the mining company in Potlatch up to a little star at Hoodsport. I need a driver. Are you interested? Blaine paused. That can be a dangerous trip, he said. Really? Thomas asked. I made it the other day and it seemed pretty quiet to me. Beautiful country along the canal. Yeah, it is that, Blaine agreed. But you never know what's lurking in those woods. And Thomas chuckled. Nothing a guy like you can't handle, he said. Blaine rubbed his chin, weighing his decision and his words carefully. I suppose you're right, he answered and smiled at him. I'll take the job. Wow. Certainly another one. Wow. As always expected, from the incredible mind of Jack LaFountain, nothing but a 5-star adventure there. Author of Death Rides the Red and Bayou Moon. Why not show your love and support for Jack by heading over to the Amazon bookstore, of which I'll leave the link to in the description box below. There you'll find this plus many others that we have covered on this show, and some others that we have not. But one thing's for certain, you can certainly lose yourself for a few hours. And if you're lucky like me, you'll struggle to put the book down at all. Of course though, a big thank you to Jack for his incredible patience, dedication, and support. I think this might possibly be the best one yet. Of course though guys, please do let me know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid crew. If you're an aspiring writer or just want to have a crack at things like myself, please do get in touch with me at the usual email as on screen, which is dmtforestaffair@gmail.com. I really look forward to hearing from you. I hope everybody's had a fantastic week at work or school and studying, whatever it is that you do. Are you trying to keep fit and focused during these testing times? But above all guys, remember, be safe, not sorry.